it was so very interesting to see what that would mean for the Topspiel on Saturday between Gladbach and Bayern, the Klassiker. We can call it the Klassiker still because, once again, it did feel like a Klassiker. Bayern were totally dominant in this game, but, many will point out that Gladbach did pretty much everything right defensively, played this match really well. I do think at time maybe they were a little bit too passive when it comes to passing out the ball, a little bit too sloppy. But we need to also add that this could have all ended very differently if Tim Kleindienst puts that header below the bar rather than above the bar, right? There was a big chance to put this game away for Gladbach. I think if they score that first goal, this would have been very difficult for Bayern Munich. Ultimately, a penalty decides this. Olise brought down in the box. I think we can discuss this one all day long. Bayern fans will maybe point to the fact that Rocco Reitz was hit in his head or used his arms to not be hit in his head in the first half, and that should have been a penalty. I don't know. I don't think so, but here we are. I think on balance, Bayern deserved to win this game. I mean, what's the XG, Stefan? Was 3.89 versus 0.64. I mean, if they hadn't won this game, I think the discussion here would be, why are they not scoring enough goals? And maybe that should be still the discussion because, at the end of the day, it took another penalty to get the game, to win the game for them.
Yeah, it wasn't the best game of the weekend, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. It actually struck me as, it reminded me quite a lot of a Premier League game, to be honest with you, in the sense that, the Premier League is quite famous for being very pragmatic, at times quite defensive, or at least the teams know how to set up defensively to frustrate the bigger teams in the league. And Gladbach obviously just stunk the place up. They had no intention of playing free-flowing, attacking football. I found myself kind of raising an eyebrow when I was listening to the commentary of this match. I was watching it, and it was obviously like maybe in the 70th minute. And I think Gladbach were finally kind of bombing forward and created chances, and the co-commentator, who I forget who was on, but he said, "Oh, this is great. If only we saw more of this from Gladbach in the first half." And I was like, so far in the second half, they conceded a goal. So if we saw more of this in the first half, they'd now be 2 goals behind rather than 1. So, it's one of those unfortunate things in football that neutrals obviously want something that tends to typically not favour the smaller team in the game. And how many times have we sat here in this podcast and we've watched Bayern thump a team 4 or 5-0 because, the likes of Augsburg or Hoffenheim or Bochum or someone have attempted to play gegenpressing against Bayern. They've attempted to pass the ball out of defence against Bayern, or they've attempted to just bomb forward against Bayern. And obviously Bayern, like, well, thank you very much. You have less space behind. We'll duly take advantage of that and happily, score a bucket of goals. Gladbach didn't do that. Gladbach set up to try and really frustrate Bayern. And I thought for the most part, they probably did that. I think we were chatting to subscribers, obviously, in the Substack chat about it. And I think I said at half-time that Thomas Muller chance was maybe the only clear-cut one that comes to mind from the first half. And yeah, it was dull football. Maybe even Gladbach fans weren't enjoying it in the Borussia Park, but I'm sure Gerardo Siona would have been grinning from ear to ear when he went into the locker room at half-time and saying, look, more of that, guys. We'll get our chances. We just got to make sure we take them. But for the most part, they were playing their match plan perfectly well. It obviously kind of came undone when the penalty, which... yeah, like you said, I think it is quite contentious. I kind of said on social media that I thought it was quite soft. I had some Bayern fans push back in that. It's not really something it's not a hill I'm really willing to die on, to be honest with you. I can understand there's contact there, that's fine. I've seen worse calls. It's not really the end of the world. Maybe quite fitting that it was actually Michael Olise who got it, because I thought he was probably Bayern Munich's best player. And actually, that's maybe something that's more interesting, or maybe something I'm more interested in talking about in terms of which Bayern players actually did play well in this game, because we talked about going into the match that it was a game in which someone was going to have to step up for the absence of Jamal Musiala. And as far as I can really tell, out of the course of that kind of starting lineup, the 2 players that actually in fact, 3 players that stood out to me were Olise, Kimmich, and actually Goretzka. I thought Goretzka had a good game. He looked like that kind of box-to-box player that we're used to seeing in these kind of matches. And I thought Kimmich and Olise were the 2 kind of great playmakers. Everything seemed to be going through Olise. And in stark contrast, I thought Thomas Muller was okay, but not quite the same player that he once was, obviously. Harry Kane was very quiet, which we've unfortunately come to expect in these kind of games. And then I thought Leroy Sané was unfortunately just absolutely dreadful, and worryingly so. And that's obviously what led to much of the frustration, I think, with Bayern, in the sense that our front line just wasn't quite ticking as it used to. But I think there's positives from Bayern to take away from it. I think there's positives from Gladbach to take away from it. And I guess Bayern probably deserved all 3 points on the balance of things.
I thought Fonzie had a good game too. Davies had a the first half. The second half he dropped off a little bit, but the first half was really good on the left side. Put a lot of pressure and really linked up well in the attack. So yeah, there was a few players I thought that were really, really good. I mean, the Goretzka story is so interesting, right? Because there was quite a bit surprised that he was the one. It was initially Pavlovic in that starting 11, and then was Goretzka swapped out and they had to delete the starting 11 graph and put a new one out. But obviously there's so much discussion on him right now because of the impending Tom Bishop signing, and he's supposed to come in straight away and replace Goretzka now, not even go out on loan again, if you believe the reports that are out there right now. So it's interesting that he's getting so much playing time and increasing his market value, so to say. I guess Bayern are setting themselves up for a major sell in the summer, but I thought that was all really interesting, and it really, and I had this thought that when I watched this, because it seemed also fluent, and then there was Harry Kane, which just kind of stood around a bunch in the attack, and I was thinking to myself, how many goals would Bayern Munich have at this point if Kleindienst was actually on the other end playing, right? Because he's also quite a tall, lanky kind of forward, but Julian Nagelsmann, for example, loves playing him for the German national team because he's so fluid, right? He's so very good at linking up with the players around him. And I was thinking to myself, I mean, this would have been the sort of game where Tim Kleindienst would have feasted and maybe already had 2 or 3 goals at halftime. And it's really interesting how this Bayern attack has evolved under Kompany, and I actually think looks a lot better. The football is a lot prettier, but it almost feels like because of Harry Kane, they're kind of a little bit stuck. It just doesn't work quite the same way. And I understand he scores the penalty, and Joshua Kimmich actually then comes out and makes a point to the press that it's really, really difficult to score that many penalties in a row because he's like on this penalty streak and all that sort of thing. And I'm like, yeah, that's all great, but you are allowed to score from open play, and that is just not happening with him right now. And I think at the moment it's holding back this Bayern attack from being this free-scoring, free-flowing attacking machine to something that seems to just keep stuttering at times.
Yeah, what's interesting you mentioned that, actually, because I was going to actually bring up the fact that there were some interesting Kingsley Coman quotes that came about this week. I think he sat down with, I think it was Rio Ferdinand he spoke to on Rio Ferdinand's podcast, and Ferdinand asked him about the difference between Harry Kane and Robert Lewandowski, and Coman was quite interested on it. He said, I've played with few strikers that make the winger better. With Harry, I feel like he'll enjoy as much going down, finding the really nice pass, as going up and finishing to score. He's one of the strikers that's easiest to play with as a winger. And then on the comparisons between Kane and Lewandowski, he said they're pretty similar, but I would say Harry has a bit more impact in the game. He's in the game building, as in he's in the build-up, while Lewandowski is really a box striker. He can also keep the ball good and everything, but I would say Harry can really drop and can play almost as a number 10 or midfielder, bringing the ball up sometimes. So obviously sometimes he's less in the box. I'm trying to find the part I thought was really quite telling. Lewandowski is more like moving good or killer in the box, but then Harry has his distance shot, which Lewandowski is less. I've just kind of lost it, but I was looking for it, to be honest. But the interesting thing is that he's basically suggesting that Harry Kane's maybe more accommodating of other players in his team. He drops deep, he can play as number 10, he can set up other players. This is stuff that we already knew. But then he also basically is implying that Lewandowski's the kind of striker who sits in the box and just screams at everyone to give him the ball. And, Bayern fans will know the history between Coman and Lewandowski. And it's one of the things that, obviously, when Lewandowski was planning on leaving the club, there was a few players in the squad who allegedly were quite happy to see him go because of the way he plays. Now, I think anyone would probably say that's just Lewandowski being a world-class player and demanding he gets the ball because he's very good at putting it in the back of the net.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think it was quite an interesting time for those quotes to come out, because in this kind of game, as you said with Kleindienst, I think Bayern would have been far better placed with Lewandowski in this lineup rather than Harry Kane in this specific game, because if they had Lewandowski in the box, they could fire the ball into the box for 90 minutes and Lewandowski would eventually get at the end of one of those. Whereas with Kane, he does go quiet in these big games because he kind of, instead of being the focal point of attack, he likes to be the kind of facilitator of guys like Sané or Musiala or Kingsley Coman and Michael Olise as well to an extent. And yeah, look, that might work perfectly well for him. In a few months' time, he might be sitting here in a Champions League semi-final or even a Champions League final and talking about the exquisite assist that Harry Kane pulled off for the winning goal,
or the penalty he scored to win it.
The penalty he scored to win it. But I do kind of feel like in these games in particular, it does kind of underline the difference between Kane and a kind of classic number 9, as you said, because if Bayern had that focal point attack, I think they probably would have found it easier to get through that Gladbach defence. And it's just an interesting comparison, I think.
We often get criticized for being anti-Bayern because we're critical. I see the notes underneath the podcast, and we're not Bayern haters. We just poke deficiencies. We find the deficiencies in what is a very, very good squad. And I think to be honest with you, the Bayern bosses would probably agree with everything we say. When you talk to them, the Bayern bosses are quite critical of the shortcomings themselves, and that that's why the club is where it is, because they don't sit on their laurels like some other teams in the Bundesliga, for Borussia Dortmund, and they are quite critical of themselves. The Harry Kane discussion is so very interesting, because I do still think that signing him and bringing him to the Bundesliga was a masterstroke by Bayern Munich. It created narratives and stories, and it was a really important big get for the club that said, I think, really kind of underlined the status of them in world football as one of, in my opinion, one of the top 3 clubs. The fact that they can just go out and get anyone, and beat out competition that seems to be bigger and feels like they're playing in bigger leagues, and they still can get it done. So it's really hard here to criticize Harry Kane, and I think the difference between him and Robert Lewandowski boils down to also the fact, and I mean, the players, and you were quite right, the players weren't always happy with Robert Lewandowski because him and his entourage were quite self-centered. I remember going to many Bayern Munich games, and there was him and his clan around his wife and his friends. They would all hang out and speak Polish and be in their own kind of clique, and then it's really in their own kind of group. And that was seen critically by a lot of Bayern Munich players. And, he's doing well now in Spain, so kudos to him. I do think he is, in my opinion, still think that Robert Lewandowski is a more complete striker than Harry Kane. This is a hill I will die on. But, I do think that Harry Kane does get you goals in these important moments like the penalty. But he does go also really, really quiet for long stretches. And he does also maybe play a style that doesn't always suit a fluid attack that the club wants to build. And, he also does have a body that likes to break down at times, especially as getting older. And so, you get into situations like that Real Madrid game last year where he's playing completely hurt and is out of form and struggles, right, with the pace in particular. So, these are all things that are true, and I think as this club evolves forward and going forward, and there's been so many discussions about bringing in another striker who can maybe come in and help Harry Kane in certain moments, or maybe if it doesn't go well against Gladbach, to bring him in, right, or have a second striker playing next to him, and then the club repeatedly shuts us down, and I understand the contract negotiations are more important at this stage, and that they prioritize that over bringing in new players because it's going to be expensive, right? I mean, some of the Alphonso Davies numbers leaked today in the Spanish press, which in my opinion, I think suggest that it's getting closer and closer, that he's going to make around 20 million euros. So that's all expensive. So there's maybe no financial room for a second striker. But I do think that is something that the club needs to address. Like even when Lewandowski was around, they had Choupo-Moting, they had Sandro Wagner, they had guys that could come in and add a little bit extra or maybe get a goal in key moments. And I do also think it's no coincidence that since Lewandowski left, the point totals of Bayern Munich have shrunk significantly at the end of the season, right? I think there is a direct correlation here because Lewandowski would get lots of goals, even in big matches. And, he was criticized, of course, by the Bayern board for not scoring in big games, but I don't actually think that's really true. Like, he has scored in many big games, not only for Bayern, but also for Borussia Dortmund. So, yeah, it is an interesting discussion. I think as long as Harry Kane is going to be at the club and in this position, this is going to be a debate that's going to surround him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, at the end of the day, Bayern Munich won the game, so we have to kind of just accept that and just move on for it. And I think that's deserving. And, like, and we also have to point out that his penalty was outstanding. He took it tremendously well. And if that's what he's on the pitch to do, then he did it very well. And I think at this point of the season, coming back from the winter break, Vincent Kompany's team perhaps aren't as sharp as they would be because they've had to take a long break. And they're missing Musiala kind of last minute as well because it was decided maybe like 3 or 4 days before the game that he was out with the illness. I think it was just one of those games where Kompany will say, look, we'll take 3 points and move on. Gladbach are obviously a team that are potential banana skin for Bayern more often than not, especially at Borussia Park where they've done tremendously well this season. We talked about it in the previous show about how Gladbach going into this game are the 3rd most informed team since match day 7 to this point. So there were absolutely no pushovers, and I thought they did absolutely everything they could to frustrate Bayern. And yeah, maybe it required a penalty, and maybe Kane wasn't, his outstanding self in terms of creating lots of chances, but other players stepped up, and I think Kompany will be happy with that. So, look, they go into the next match day, and it's just about picking up points. I think at this point in the season, just getting the points on the board, and then you can analyse the performances later. But job done, I guess. Maybe not the most thrilling game, but I'm sure Bayern fans will be happy that they picked up all 3 points and some key players like, Goretzka, Olise, Alphonso Davies, guys like that stepped up and looked very well. And Kim, I thought, who also had a good game as well.
Yeah, no, I think overall the Bayern fans can be really happy with this result. This is Gladbach playing defensive football is basically what they do and has gotten them so many wins against Bayern Munich. Every single one. I can't think of any single Klassiker in recent years where Gladbach dominated Bayern Munich. It was always this, right? This is always their match plan. And this is, I think, why they do so well against Bayern Munich, because they are so frustrating to play against when Bayern Munich come to town. They just seem to get the discipline together and make it work. And so for Bayern Munich to navigate this fixture and come away with 3 points. And, now we're getting to the stretch where 3 points really do matter, because they lose or draw this one, the gap between Leverkusen shrinks to 1 or 2 points, right? Now they can still slip up in Leverkusen, for example, will still be ahead. And we're getting to that territory now, right? Where you have to start making calculations, because I don't know how many more games Leverkusen are going to lose this season, or any. They seem firing out of all cylinders, and yeah, this is going to make the second half of the season extremely fascinating, I think, because both these teams are looking to gear up and make a really good run at it. And I think it's going to be a great title race, Stefan. I think we're going to have 2 clubs going to play excellent football, and 2 clubs that have almost no margin to error to win the title. And I think that's going to make an intriguing storyline from here to the end of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a good way to kind of finish up the show, I think. Just kind of wrap that up by saying Leverkusen and Bayern look like they've kind of got their act together. More so Leverkusen than Bayern, obviously, because Bayern started the season well, but they've had a few hiccups as well. There's no doubt about it, especially in the Champions League. So it's great they're both doing well. You'd much rather have 2 teams at the peak of their powers competing for this title, rather than what usually happens in the Bundesliga, which is the Bayern's closest rivals kind of just capitulate and Bayern kind of stroll to the league title. So it's great. I thought it was great to see Leverkusen do as well as they did against Bayern, against Dortmund. It was a professional performance, maybe not, an all-time classic. I don't think they'll be releasing any DVDs of that match for any time soon. But it's 3 points, and equally Bayern did the exact same thing as Gladbach. So we're looking at two very polished, two very professional title contenders, and long may it continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And it will continue on Tuesday. Dortmund against Kiel kicks us off on Tuesday. And then, of course, on Wednesday, Bochum against St. Pauli kicks us off. And then we have some really great matches. Stuttgart against Leipzig, for example. Leverkusen against a high-flying Mainz should actually be a pretty interesting game. Freiburg and Frankfurt. And yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to the big games on the midweek fixture list, which we're going to cover in one way or another. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Bet Online, and we'll be back very soon with more content, Stefan. And until then, auf Wiedersehen.